Welcome to part 6 in our tutorial series Introduction to 3D, trueSpace for Illustrators. Here we're using the same scene that we've been using all along. We've modeled the scene, we've textured the scene, we've added the lighting to the scene, and now we're going to render the scene. So selecting Render Scene to File, here we see our Render to File options dialog box, the location where we're going to save our scene to, the name that we wish to save the file to, as well as the type of file. And in this case we're using PSD format, but as you can see there are a number of other formats as well. But getting back to our Photoshop PSD format, once that's chosen we can choose sizes. The window in the scene we have is 520 by 500. Here's a preset series of image sizes, some for PAL, some for NTSC, etc. And here custom size if we wish. We'll just use the 520 by 500 window. The rest of these options on this particular dialog box will affect your animation, so they are going to carry little importance here as we're rendering single frame. So when we hit render, we are immediately given our Photoshop PSD options dialog box. Here we make decisions as to what is going to happen as far as the rendering goes. Single will render a single layer to the PSD format. Per feature will render a single layer for each of the features that we select here. Diffuse, specular, a shadow, reflection, refraction, and post-process. The Perlite setting will render a single layer per light that is in trueSpace. The per geometry layer is something that we are already familiar with, in that we have used the geometry layers in trueSpace and place different objects on each layer. The colors of the wire mesh denote the layer that it currently sits on, so that's pretty straightforward. The channels, if we wish, we can render alpha mask or depth mask, shadow mask, view angle mask, or normal mask. Again, a little bit of legwork on your part here. Even using this included scene that you'll find in the resource files, you can begin to set these settings and see exactly how individual settings will affect your final output to PSD file. Again, additional settings as well, whether we wish to have channels rendered as layers, a compatibility mode that will affect you if you do not have a Photoshop piece of software. And beginning frames with 0 is again something for animation, and we're not too concerned with that as we're rendering stills. So let's select the single layer and do a quick render here, and I'll take a moment to remind you that we are showing you the very beginning and the very end of the renders. This helps to save a little time in the tutorial series, but you will notice when you're rendering on your own machine, these renders will take substantially more time depending on the complexity of the scene being rendered. So once we've done the single layer, I guess we can move on to the per feature. And again, each feature will be rendered to its own layer. And we'll leave all of these checked except for post-process, as we do not use any post-process effects in this particular scene. So with that unchecked, let's move on, and we will see a render for each of the features. So you're going to see a cycle through the render engine representing each of the features that we are rendering. So depending on how many are selected, that's going to determine how many layers we will have in the final PSD file. On the per feature, as we move through the features, the layers of the renderings from the previous cycles will remain in view, and what you'll do is see a more or less a progressive series of renders leading to the final render, which in our case here is going to be pretty much a photorealistic quality render. But again, it's important to note that within the PSD file itself, you will see each of these layers separate. Here the shadow layers being rendered this particular cycle through the render engine, adding some of the deeper shadows within the scene. And again, where the render takes a little bit of time, we're going to skip through and accelerate that render for you a little bit. Here the glass and some highlights are being rendered. And this should be our final pass through the render right now, giving us our final photorealistic quality render of this particular scene. And hopefully you understand what photorealistic means, very close to real life quality. And who can say how something as pristine as this particular image does not look as if it was a real life image. So again, finishing off this render, that'll be another PSD file in our folder. Once our per features has been finished, we can move on to the Perlite scenario. And again, we'll render this, set us for Perlite, and begin the rendering cycles. So on a Perlite, as the light hits the objects within the scene, the pixels are going to be affected. And those pixels which are affected are being rendered per layer for each light within the scene. So depending on how many lights you have within the scene, that'll determine the number of final PSD layers that you will have within the file itself. And again, you can add all of these images up to give you the photorealistic render, or of course choose individual layers within the PSD file in Photoshop or your 2D editor and work them as you wish. So again, some very interesting features available on a Perlite basis within the Photoshop PSD export. And with the completion of that PSD, let's move ahead with the next scenario, which will be our per geometry layer. So we'll label our file and click render to get our options panel, select per geometry layer, and in this case let's select the channels as well. And again, we'll begin to render per geometry layer. Here our initial layer holds nothing but the floor of the scene, so it's going to be a rather boring little cycle through the render engine. But you will see that there's method in the madness as we cycle through the next layer. We see here is the actual liquid layer, denoting the level of perfume within the bottle. So everything sitting on that particular layer gets rendered. Then of course we had the caps or the glass. Here we're seeing the glass being rendered. The caps were on a separate layer as well. The labels were on a separate layer. And of course the spray nozzle assemblies. Here we see the alpha mask, or alpha channel I should say, being rendered to a PSD layer. And again, these renders will take a little longer on your machine. We're cutting out the middle part of the rendering to save time in the tutorial. But as you can see, the most brilliant set of renders coming from within trueSpace, exported of course to PSD layers, which allows you to then edit to your satisfaction within your 2D editing program. So there you have rendering to PSD file format in trueSpace. Now we can move on to the next step in the tutorial series, part 8.